Hey, everybody, welcome to this week's Debrief. This is our weekly deep breath on the news, although this would be a modified debrief because we're going to attack this week's report in a series of parts. So we'll have part one today, and then we'll also have part two tomorrow because we have a big event tonight, which we'll talk a little bit about, and we'll talk about your interest or your lack thereof in this event, which has been a big topic of conversation online and really a big topic for our country over the last 18 months or so. So we have a lot to cover today, but we're going to try to do it quick, concise, nonpartisan. That's our goal always at Smarter News. And I really appreciate you rolling with us as we try different things. I was thinking a little bit about this just as my kids literally just ran out the door with their dad. Like you might have heard the door slam as I started this recording because we're trying to juggle two different jobs, two different entrepreneurs in the household, and three kids, and an unexpected situation, as always, as typical, right? Is anything expected these days? This week, we thought we were going to have a week away from our house. We had family coming into town. My husband canceled a work trip. I had a babysitter coming. We thought everything was going to work out. We were going to stay working, but we could visit with family. And then everything got canceled. Family didn't visit, the babysitter canceled, and then my son, listen to this, out of all things, because you've heard a lot of things about my family over the last couple months and emergency room visits, he actually cut his leg open on an oyster bed. Yeah, I didn't know you could actually do that. But apparently you can, and then he can't swim, and we're at a place where you get to go to the beach and you get to go to a pool, and so he can't swim. So we're actually leaving early today. But before that, I thought, wait a minute, I still have to do the debrief for Smarter News. We still got to get it in. And for some of you, you may remember that when we started Smarter News, and listen, it's been 5 years, almost 5 years to the day. I just thought about this morning, preparing for this. 5 years to the day since I left traditional media. Some people call it mainstream media. Some people call it legacy media. I'm just going to call it traditional media. I left my job as a national news anchor in New York City, relocated to Texas sort of unexpectedly with two kids, a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. And then over the course of the next several months, started to build Smarter News, not really knowing that entrepreneurship was in my future. And at the beginning of Smarter News, what we would do, because I didn't really know how to put together a production schedule, what that would actually look like. And so one of the things I would do is with such little kids, little Sesame Street on, little breakfast, little high chair situation, I was able to do a morning live most days of the week. And we would do these short reports. We'd have the kids in the background. But then things changed. I added another child. My kids started to grow and they got out of their high chairs, which is so frustrating for all parents everywhere. And it didn't work quite the same way. Some of the news cycle became more serious. There's always serious news stories, but it became more difficult to present news in a way with that chaos that felt appropriate at times. So we had to stop that. And we've tried some different things. And now a lot of people like social media stories, Instagram stories, which works for me as well. But sometimes I don't like it that the stories disappear because I want to make sure that what we're doing and how we're covering something is so appropriate. We want it on our feed. So we've gone through a lot of different things. We've tried a lot of different things. And recently, one of the things I've tried to commit to are these weekly debriefs because I want to be able to connect. And then, of course, when we commit to them, then Instagram stops working for me when I started to do a live. Do you get the feeling like do I need to burn some sage? Like if you have any recommendation, let me know. But I really do believe we're doing good in the world. And when you do good in the world, sometimes some obstacles are being put in front of you. You just got to keep on rolling. So thanks for rolling with us. I really appreciate it. So here's what we're going to do today. There's a couple news stories that I think are really important based on some questions that you asked about. Of course, tonight we do have a public hearing from the House Select Committee investigating the events of January 6th. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about that. What's interesting is when I polled the Smarter News audience about what you wanted to hear about that, many of you expressed frustration with the process. Even those of you who are really attentive on this story and say that you're going to watch the whole thing tonight feel frustrated with the way that the media has covered it. And quite frankly, what you all agree on is that you want smarter coverage. I think I have a way to do that today. I'm just going to give you a little bit of like a Cliff Notes version of why this hearing matters, or what are some of the things to think about. And one of the things I'm thinking about for not just this news story, but news stories in general, because we've been in such this rapid fire breaking news environment, is it's easy to forget that there are real people behind all these stories. There's a real person behind Smarter News that's struggling on a regular basis. That's me. There's a real person that's in the audience that's watching as well. You have your own struggles, your own stories. And when we're watching leaders, we hold them to a really high standard, don't we? And we should. Elected leaders especially. But they're all people. Politics are involved. They're all people. They all have their own story. And I want to talk a little bit about some of those stories that have led to this moment. But let's first just talk about a couple things that are really important. Your number one story that you all have been asking about is the economy. And there was something that happened this week that I think is worth just, again, kind of like that. I'm going to just put my antenna up and say, hey, let's just pay attention to this. So this was from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This is it's a fancy term, OECD. This is a big group of a lot of powerful economies. They come together, it's an organization of the most powerful economies in the entire world. So one of the things that came out of the meeting this week is concern about the economy. And we're getting that a lot from a lot of different places, which is part of the reason why I think paying attention to this matters. In general, would this be something that necessarily we would look at and we would pay attention to it? Would it be its own story? It's hard to know. But one of the things that this group said is that they downgraded the world economic growth to 3%. Now, does that really matter? It's 3%. It still says the economy is growing. It matters in this context. They downgraded it from a forecast that they put out a couple months ago. And this is in addition to a couple really big groups, the World Bank, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund. These are big economic groups or monetary groups that are connected to economies all over the world. And what we've seen consistently from all of them is a downgrade of economic growth. Why is that? There's concern, obviously, about what's happening in Eastern Europe, Ukraine and Russia, specifically when it comes to food supplies. Remember how much wheat is produced in that part of the world. And because Russia is still a big economy, there's a concern about how that's affecting the entire globe. Then, on top of it, this issue with Shanghai, with what's been going on in China, these massive COVID shutdowns that have shut down. Shanghai is the largest city in China. They've come out of this first, what should I say, the first major shutdown that we've seen this year from Shanghai, what we've been covering over the last several weeks. They have seemed to sort of emerge from that, but there's still concerns there of it. And you have a huge shipping port in that particular city. And so that's added insult to injury for supply chain issues. So this is what's percolating. Some of you have asked, this was an interesting question, is inflation something that the entire world is dealing with? We know we're dealing with it here in the United States, and the answer is yes. And that's one of the differences in this particular economic story than others. Sometimes you can say, well, hey, the United States is dealing with massive inflation, but the rest of the world is it? No, a lot of places are dealing with this inflationary pressure. And why does inflation matter? That means your dollar buys you less, and we don't want your dollar to buy you less. We want you to be economically strong and sustainable, because the more you participate in the economy, the better the economy is overall. This is just a friendly reminder about how much you matter. The U.S. consumer is the major driver of economic growth in the United States and the rest of the world. So what you do, what you buy at Target really matters. Don't use that to justify purchases you shouldn't buy. I know what that's like to go into Target and then you pick up like 25 things that you didn't need, but you feel like you do. I know that. The question is, are you limiting yourself now? Are you really watching your spending more? And that little ripple effect across many, many families can impact the entire economy. That's one of the reasons we're going to be watching a really important economic data point in the future, which is about whether or not the U.S. economy is still growing. If we're showing contraction, and we show 2 3-month periods of contraction, so we're not growing, we're contracting, that would be a loose definition of being in a recession. And remember, when someone says you're in a recession, that means you've already been in the recession for a while, because the data is backwards looking and you're already moving ahead. So just a couple things to keep in mind there. The president is actually in LA, which is interesting timing, because that means he's not in Washington, D.C. for this really political event, which is the House Select Committee on January 6th. So the president is in LA for the Summit of the Americas. This may not be something that you hear about all the time, although it's been in effect for almost a decade. These are major meetings. Speaking of large economies that are coming together, this is a major meetings of North America, Central America, and South America. This has been controversial because the White House, we're the host right now of the Summit of the Americas, did not invite Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. That would make sense, doesn't it? Because these leaders of what the United States says is authoritarian regimes, Cuba being a state sponsor of terrorism designated by the State Department, would be on U.S. soil and would be at this big, that's very difficult diplomatically to do. So the United States says, hey, we're not inviting them because they don't belong here. Well, some other countries believe that they did, including Mexico. So Mexico's president is not attending. And in fact, there are several presidents or leaders, high-profile leaders of these countries not attending. They may have sent like a surrogate in their place, but the president of the United States is at this meeting, and the president of Mexico, one of our largest trading partners, and a major issue when it comes to immigration, is not because of this issue. So Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, these are all the major countries that we talk about when we talk about immigration at the southern border. Their leaders are not in attendance. So this is a story to watch. We're going to be watching this particularly for any news when it comes to immigration, because we know that's going to be a major story going into the midterms. We know we're also not that far away from another monthly report about what's happening at the U.S. southern border. We know that there is a security economic angle to that story. And so this is where the president is this week. And I always think it's important to know where the president is. Melissa, you asked about what's going on in Uvalde. What's the latest there? Here's just a little bit. We don't have a ton of new information. You are hearing more personal stories, and I'll explain why in a second. But we did hear from the Justice Department this week, actually just over the last 24 hours. And remember, the Justice Department announced that there was going to be an investigation into what happened. And so when you hear an investigation, you might think, well, is that a criminal investigation into law enforcement because of a lack of response? Because obviously that's been one of the big topics. And what the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland said is that the investigation into the law enforcement response, he just clarified this, is not going to be criminal in nature. So it is going to be one of those investigations that's looking at what was the response. They call it a critical incident review. So they'll gather information. That doesn't mean that you wouldn't see a civil or a criminal case in the future. That's not what we're saying. We actually don't know. And there's actually still a lot of unknowns about what exactly happened and why. We know some of the big overarching themes, but some of this more specifics, this is why the investigation is taking place. And there's multiple investigations happening at different levels. That's also something important to note. Why are you hearing more details about what happened that day from survivors? You're hearing about it for a couple different reasons this week. Obviously, if someone is a survivor of an event, they have every right to decide when they're going to talk to the press. And I'm sure there's been a lot of requests over the last 2 weeks. But you also saw on Capitol Hill a series of hearings. And this is a reminder about why hearings matter, because oftentimes they are on a topic that is not only important to lawmakers, but to their constituents. So you're getting hearings on a series of different topics related to extremism was one of them that the Senate took up this week in the aftermath of the Buffalo mass shooting. We also heard from the Committee on Oversight and Reform in the House. That's where there was a pediatrician talking about his experience trying to treat children in the aftermath of this event. And you got, again, some extreme details of what he saw. And you also heard from families. So this is one of the reasons why, if you're seeing this in the news cycle and you're wondering, well, where is this all coming from? It's coming from that. So I just want to clarify it. All right, let's talk about the hearing in question. We're just going to talk about this for a couple minutes. So the hearing tonight, the House Select Committee, is different for a couple different reasons, including the fact that it's happening during prime time. The hearings that I just mentioned all happened in mid-morning. And hearings typically happen then because they can run for several hours. And it's the middle of the day. It's the middle of the workday. Seldom do they start at 8 p.m. Eastern time, which is when this public hearing, this stage of this investigation is going to take place. So let's just talk a little bit about, why does this, what are some of the reasons why this matters? I know there's a lot of different political opinions on this, but I thought these are a couple things I want to point out. One, the committee has to move now. The committee has to move now because they need to present some of their findings before November. November is the midterm elections. Everybody in the House, where this committee is taking place, is up for re-election every 2 years. So if the Democrats lose the majority in the House and the Republicans come in at the majority, then this committee probably doesn't go further. And the investigation probably doesn't go further because Republicans are not going to have an interest necessarily in pursuing this. Now, anything can happen. We don't really know. But there is a timeline here, and I just want us to be aware of it. This is why we're seeing some of these public hearings starting now. This is why you're seeing Democrats try to make sure it's in the news cycle in a different way. They're doing it in the evening. This is a really big platform issue for Democrats. It has been so since the event, and some Republicans as well. And actually, I think it could be argued fairly that both parties, in their different positions on this issue, have made this an issue for their party platforms. So there's a timeline here. And this is something just, again, to be aware of. One of the central questions, and this is number 2, that when we step back and say, like, what is this all for? It's not only trying to piece together what happened that day and to have an official public record on it, which is what this investigation is attempting to do and past investigations have done. This is when you have select committees come together and say, well, how did this happen? And how can we get to the bottom of this in order to prevent it from happening again? But one of the consequences of this that could be more immediate than just having a historic record of it is, will there be any criminal charges that could come from it? Is the investigation that lawmakers doing, they don't have prosecutorial, say that 10 times fast. They don't have the power to prosecute, right? They're not going to prosecute former President Trump. But did they come across something in their investigation that they could refer to the Justice Department, that we could see additional charges, criminal charges? I mean, those could be the stakes. And this is one of the reasons why, when we keep hearing politicians talk about this event, we're like, well, what did they find? They've done hours and hours and hours, right? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of research and interviews, and collected a lot of documents. So 1, we need the historic record. 2, is it going to lead anywhere that's significant? Here's the third thing that I think is really important that's also getting lost in the politics of this moment. When we look back on the date of January 6, 2021, again, a lot of different perspectives on that. You know, some say this was an organized coup of the U.S. government. There are those that say this was an unruly crowd, civil disobedience. I mean, you have there's the whole spectrum of different opinions on this. That day, one of the biggest stories to me was the security situation at the U.S. Capitol. Democrat, Republican, doesn't really matter. You have lawmakers there that are really, this is a huge target, the U.S. Capitol. And we saw security fail in real time. If you had, and this is very difficult, and I'm not trying to get into scary hypothetics that we don't need to get into. We've had enough real scary things that we've been covering. But if you had an organized group that was heavily armed, that was in the U.S. Capitol, you could have a really different result than what we had. And security at the U.S. Capitol has been a big issue of debate since that time. So I'm really curious on that aspect of it, because that, to me, crosses all partisan lines. We know the U.S. Capitol is important to American citizens. It's an important symbol of our government. We want it to be a safe place. So did we learn anything significant on that? A little context on this. How much does this cost? Because remember, time is money. And when we're talking about money related to Congress, I hate to remind us all, but it's our money that's being used. How much does this cost? The Washington Post had a couple estimates. And so the committee has already spent $2.5 million, is on pace to spend more than $9 million by the end of December. A lot of this is going to personal expenses. I'd like to get some more clarity on what that means. And payments to outside contractors. Just for, again, added context to this, there was a Benghazi Select Committee. Do you remember the situation in Benghazi when we had some American contractors that were murdered in Benghazi, Libya? There was a big investigation on that, led by Republicans. So different situation, but it gives us something to compare it to. So the Select Committee, when it came to the investigation on Benghazi, spent just over $7 million in a 2.5-year period. So what we're seeing is that this committee is on pace to spend more than that. I guess we have to remember inflation to bring this all full circle. But I also took a look at who was on the Benghazi Select Committee, because I wanted to see if it was as partisan as this committee is right now, because it is partisan at this point. The majority of the committee is Democrats. You have 2 Republicans sitting on the committee. Both of them have very similar stances of what happened on that day. So you don't have a strong critical voice on the committee. For the House Select Committee, when it came to Benghazi, you did have more Democrats on it. It was something like, this is off the top of my head, was it 7 Republicans and 5 Democrats? It wasn't equal. There were more Republicans because Republicans were the engine behind that investigation. But there were more Democrats, and there were stronger Democrats that were more friendly to that administration at the time, which was the Obama administration. So just some added context on that. So real quick here, a couple things, people that you're going to be paying attention to. One of the leading Democrat voices on this committee has been Congressman Jamie Raskin. And he's been very outspoken about what the committee has found. He's alluded to something that they have found without being very specific on it. Congressman Raskin has his own story. His son suffered from mental illness and committed suicide New Year's Eve 2020. A couple days later, Congressman Raskin's in the Capitol when this happens. He's also the congressman that led the second impeachment investigation in the House against President Trump. So this is a little bit of his backstory. There have been some Republicans that have come out and said, well, the trauma that he's experienced is shading his view of this situation. And he's actually talks about these traumatic events happening at the same time, and how that has inspired and changed his life. How could it not? So that's something you should know about Congressman Raskin. He's from Maryland. Liz Cheney obviously is the leading Republican voice here, and one of the lone Republican voices that's really been critical of the government response and what happened on January 6th. She's been very clear, Congressman Cheney, of making sure that President Trump never returns to office. She's been very outspoken on this. And because of that, she lost her leadership position in the Republican Party in the House. She's felt the effects of that. In recent days, there's been some deeper dives on her family. Obviously, she comes from a powerful political family, but she's referenced her great-great-grandfather who fought for the Union in the Civil War. And she's saying that she's kind of examined that, but that fight for what it takes to bring America together or keep America together. So just a little background on those folks, I thought kind of makes them more real rather than just politicians. But again, no real detractors, no real critics of the committee on the committee itself. And sometimes you will have that. And it's important to have a lot of different voices. So we'll see how the committee handles this. Final note for you here. I know a lot of you have asked about this event in primetime. Former president of ABC News, James Goldston, is going to be producing this. Have we ever seen anything like this before? Not in recent memory, not in something that I've covered where it's been, I'm going to have to I was taking a close, I really couldn't find anything. What does that mean for how this hearing is going to look different? I have no idea. Zero. I've met James Goldston a couple times. He's a British guy, been in the news, very well respected in the industry, left ABC just over the last year. He's a father. We talked about soccer and his kids. I was talking a lot, this will make you laugh. We were talking about me potentially working at ABC News. And I had a couple conversations with him over the years. And in one of our final conversations, we were having coffee, and we're just kind of talking, and I was explaining that I really think where the news industry was heading was away from television, that really requiring viewers to tune in to a TV set is just not where they are, and especially not busy people that are multitasking that actually just want nonpartisan news and that's it. Like they just really want the news. They don't want more vitriol. And I was talking about, where digital news was heading. And remember, this is 5 years ago because I left traditional media at that time. And he was sitting there listening to me. He was nodding and we're talking, and he goes, just sort of pauses, and he has this like tea. He had tea, which I also thought was so British. And he was like, you think more deeply on these issues than most. I'm like, I'll take that as a compliment. I think in general, if you're on television, your main priority is to stay on TV. One of the things that I definitely confused a lot of executives on is I was like, no, we need less TV. We need less TV, and we got to figure out how to serve people in a different way. I love television. Don't get me wrong. I love live TV. I think there's something really to the distribution, the reach of television networks that still really matters. But whether or not that's working for the viewers, I think is another question. And if we pause long enough to ask those questions, it can be very difficult because they could change your momentum. So anyways, just for what it's worth, I don't know James Goldston well. I don't know if he'd remember me. I hope he would after that conversation. But when I saw his name come across, I was like, whoa, really? Is that really so just so you know, that's my reaction as someone in the media business wondering, I don't think I've ever seen that before. However, I also think it's important to point out for balance, Bill Shine was a top executive at Fox News. And when he left Fox News, he almost immediately went and worked for President Trump. He has been a guiding producer in a lot of major events that President Trump had, mainly on the campaign trail. But you can see how President Trump, controversial as he is and has been, has sort of changed the game for televised events. And if you think back to the convention that the Republicans held versus the convention that the Biden team held, you saw a very different production value. Now, the president was the sitting president of the United States during a pandemic. He had a background, which was Washington, D.C. That, let alone, was a different look. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is I think it's really important to note that television executives have gone into politics and have also stepped back out from politics and gone back into television. And the incestuous relationship between the media and those in political power is something I think really to be aware of. I didn't know that it happened so much. I didn't really realize until I worked at Fox News that there would be someone that would work as part of an administration, Democrat or Republican, and then get a job on the cable news networks. I just didn't think about that. So just something to note, and we'll see what that means tonight. So I'm going to be watching the hearing tonight. I'm going to be listening along and taking notes. And then tomorrow I'll pop on. And here we are, 24 hours later. So when we last spoke, we were previewing the House Select Committee primetime hearing on its investigation into January 6th and its findings. And now we're in the aftermath of that first hearing that we saw last night. And not only witnessing the hearing and taking some notes, but also listening to commentary from a lot of different points of view to try to think about what are the key takeaways here that we should know as this story continues to develop. And I would say that is actually one of the big takeaways, is that this story is still very much developing. What we saw last night was the first of several hearings. We actually don't know how many hearings exactly. We know there's 2 more that are on the calendar for next week, for Monday and Wednesday. Those are not going to be in prime time, by the way. Those are going to start at 10 o'clock Eastern time, mid-morning, which is more typical for a hearing like this. And so we don't know what there is yet to learn. However, one of the big takeaways from the hearing last night is that there was no major new bombshell, no new smoking gun that significantly changes the story in a way that's propelling us into a completely different news cycle. We don't know what else the committee has to share, and this was certainly a very unique hearing in a lot of different ways, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But as far as that one big fact that you now need to know, that's something different than you may have heard over the last 18 months, we don't have that. We do have some new video, new audio, new information, some new interviews. But what picture that the committee is painting so far is that they believe former President Trump not only inspired the events on January 6th, not only instigated the events of January 6th, but somehow was an accomplice to the actions that day. What that looks like, being an accomplice to this particular event, can vary. It could vary very widely. And why are we really watching this investigation? We're watching it for a couple of different reasons. And we know that there's critics of the investigation saying that this is too partisan, but we also know that this is going to be a matter of public record. And so we're looking to see how is the U.S. government pulling together its resources to develop a recording of what actually transpired that day, because we certainly never want to see a day like that happen ever again. But what we're really paying close attention to specifically is understanding, as one of the largest, if not the largest investigation by the Department of Justice in American history, are there more charges to come? And do those charges involve those in the White House on that day, including former President Trump? So this is what we're not only watching the story that this committee is telling, we also want to understand the stakes. And those are the stakes here, at least in the immediate. But last night, we only got a few hours of a hearing. And we only saw 2 speakers speak that are representing the committee. That would be Congressman Thompson from Mississippi. He's the chair of the committee. And you also had Congresswoman Liz Cheney speak as well. And so they gave very complete long opening statements. And then there was the interviews of two different people. One was a law enforcement officer that day that was injured. She was injured. And one was a documentarian that was actually with the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys have been called an extremist group by the FBI, according to reports. Just a word on that. The FBI doesn't have a list of domestic terrorist groups like it does for, let's say, foreign terrorist organizations. So sometimes you hear those terms mixed, but this documentary maker was embedded, so to say, with the leader of the Proud Boys on that day. And by the way, that leader, along with several others, was just recently indicted on charges of seditious conspiracy just this week. So you had some interesting voices, but this has been limited. We don't really know how many more hearings like this are going to take place. We don't know how much more is yet to come, but we do understand the portrayal that is coming from the committee thus far. And that's what we're hearing. President Trump not only inspired and instigated this event, he's also somehow an accomplice with it. And the committee is going to prove, so it seems, what that means and what that actually looks like. So that would be the big takeaway so far. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is that in the aftermath of the hearing, I was skipping around to different news channels. So I record the different news reports and then I compare them. You know, what does MSNBC do compared to Fox News, compared to Fox Business that was carrying this, as well as CNBC. I have a lot of recordings on my DVR that I need to clear off. But what I thought was really interesting, although the commentators on both sides were painting a very different picture of the value of this hearing. You know, those on Fox News were calling it more of a partisan witch hunt. And then those on MSNBC were talking about the significance in American history. You had very different pictures of this event. Both were actually focused on a similar part of the timeline that we learned about just last night. And that was this. The documentarian mentioned that as he was with the Proud Boys on that day, they were walking towards the Capitol as early as 10:30 in the morning. President Trump didn't speak until noon. And the documentarian said he thought that was very strange because he thought he was there because they were going to be attending this rally. So he was curious about why they were moving towards the Capitol and what exactly they were doing there. They ended up getting lunch. You know, they didn't really see a large presence at the Capitol at that time. And so this was something that was really pointed out by Congressman Thompson and really focused on. And why that is, maybe will be unveiled in the future. But here's what both sides were saying. So the more progressive angle on this was, there was premeditation. The Proud Boys were part of this plan from the beginning. They were moving towards the Capitol. There was a setup. One commentator said it was an alley-oop, so that the Proud Boys were kind of setting everything up, and then the crowd was going to come after as planned. And that was the conversation on MSNBC. Conservatives on Fox News were saying something different. They were saying, see, that timeline actually shows that what happened on the Capitol has nothing to do with President Trump because he didn't speak until noon. And look, these people were already kind of over there meandering around the Capitol as early as 10:30. So they're taking they're not disagreeing on the fact of the timeline or the portrayal by the documentarian, but they're having very different takeaways of that. So the timeline is something I'm going to be watching very closely in the future. One personal observation just when it comes to production value of this, there was a lot being said about having a former ABC executive as part of this hearing. And the truth is that this hearing was very different in many different ways. Sometimes hearings can last 4, 5, 6 hours on Capitol Hill. There can be marathon hearings. I've never seen it where lawmakers are tossing to sound bites or tossing. And when I say tossing, they're basically teeing up a video or a soundbite, sort of like a news anchor would. And there were these prepared videos that were played periodically throughout this entire event, not only for the comments by lawmakers, but also during the witness testimony. Something I've never seen. I'm very curious what sort of precedent that sets, because is that just what's going to happen now in different hearings? We talked about yesterday that this hearing is also different because of the lawmakers that are being represented on the committee. I think this really needs to be underscored. I've heard arguments as well on both sides about whether or not this is bipartisan. So if bipartisan means to you that there are representatives of both parties on this committee, that is true. The majority are Democrat and you do have 2 Republicans. If bipartisan means to you that you have 2 opposing viewpoints from 2 different political parties, that is not true, because the Republicans on this committee are clearly in agreement with the Democrats, which, by the way, is their prerogative. They can be in agreement, and they say they are because of the facts that have been portrayed or that they've uncovered. But I think it is important to know that you don't have a strong critic of the investigation or of the portrayal of January 6th on the committee. And that was very much obvious last night, even just with the two lawmakers speaking and the two witnesses. So again, it's the definition of bipartisan. What do we really mean by that? When we talk about nonpartisan on Smarter News, we talk about both sides being represented, but we also say nonpartisan because we're not pushing a political agenda. So you can be bipartisan and still push a single political agenda. And there's clearly a cohesive argument here. Some will argue it's a political motivated argument. Some will say, no, this is the committee coming together and finding the facts of what happened that day. And maybe towards the end of this investigation and the takeaways, maybe there's some more agreement or maybe there's not. And I think leaving room for what's to come in the future is really important because, again, we don't know how many more hearings are yet to come. The one thing I will say about this is someone that has worked in media for a long time. I've been a journalist. That's the longest career I've ever had in my life. Longer than wife, longer than mother, longer than any of those important things. One of the things I've really learned is the importance of brevity and really thinking about your audience. Yes, this committee clearly has a long windup that they're methodically going to go through. They're going to portray a lot clearly to the American public. They clearly have this planned out. They know where they're going with their arguments. We just haven't seen it all yet. But a news cycle or an event can quickly distract from this. And so there's a risk here. There's a benefit that you have this multiple hearings to really map out a damning portrayal of what happened that day. But that also means you have multiple hearings that can be disrupted by anything in the news cycle. And the public can quickly lose interest. And you could have a lot of other things going on. And that can be a factor in this too, about how not only the nation absorbs this story now, but how it tells it later. The committee will say we have gone through hundreds and hundreds of interviews, hours and hours of research, all of these documents, and we need the time to map it out in front of the American public. So it is unique. It's like nothing I've ever seen. Again, the major takeaway thus far is that we don't have that one big bombshell report that's come out. But we're going to leave room because we don't know what's happening next. So hopefully this is a little Cliff Notes version for you of some of the major things to note. And then next week we have 2 more hearings, 10 o'clock on Monday morning. So bright and early, we'll start the news cycle there on Monday morning. And then we also have a follow-up on Wednesday, and we'll see where we go from there. So hope this is helpful. If you have any questions and comments, let me know. And as always, more on smarternews.com. Have a great day. Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing Smarter.